Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy at the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, government leaders. We speak to each one to one. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Carol Berkin to the program. She is CUNY Graduate Center Baruch Presidential Professor of History, and she's made our nation's history accessible and wonderfully readable. Her latest book, Civil War Wives, The Life and Times of Angelina Grimke Weld, Varina Howell Davis, and Julia Dent Grant, has just been published by Alfred A. Knopf, and is as riveting and informative as it is entertaining. Welcome.
Thank you.
So why a book about Civil War women?
Well, I thought that, like much history that's important in America, it's told from a male perspective. The soldiers on the field, the politicians, the diplomats, the male abolitionists. And I tend to ask myself, I wonder how it looks from the point of view of women. And I decided that I would take a particular group of women, women who were married to influential men, and see how all those things that their stories, which have been told over and over and over again, how different it might look if we looked at it from the point of view of these women. And it, in fact, did turn out to be remarkably different.
How'd you narrow it down to these three women in particular?
Well, at first I thought, oh, scores of women available. Not so. Many of the women who were married to these famous men didn't leave papers, or their papers were lost, or they were destroyed, or they're hidden in someone's attic. And slowly the list got smaller and smaller and smaller. I did not want to do Mary Todd Lincoln because a good friend of mine had just done a big book on her. Jessie Benton Fremont, who is quite a character, has 3 books. And when the smoke had cleared, these 3 women were about the only women who could tell their stories in their own voice. I didn't want women whose stories were told by their husbands. And that in itself, I think, tells you something about gender inequality in history.
Now, there were common threads among these 3 women. What were they?
I think that all 3 of them were, I don't want to use the word victims, were subject to 19th century genteel marital norms. What was interesting was how far on one side Angelina was able to push those norms, how far Varina Howell Davis was suppressed and oppressed by those norms, and how Julia Dent Grant found happiness within those norms. And so part of the theme of the book is about 19th century genteel marriage. Secondly, they're all Southerners. They all come from slave-owning families, and their paths as a result of that proved to be enormously different. They were all ultimately married to men who, quote, made history. And one of the things I was looking at is the ways in which their wives played a part in that.
So let's begin where you begin, with the remarkable Angelina Grimke Weld. Give us a thumbnail sketch of this woman.
That's not so easy to do. She grows up in one of the richest South Carolina plantation families of the era, waited on hand and foot by slaves, as were her brothers and sisters, and for reasons that still, though I know her well, it's hard to define, she marched in a different direction. She began to feel slavery was wrong. She moves out of the South and abandons a world where she could have become a prosperous matron of Southern society. She becomes a Quaker,
moves to Philadelphia,
abandons Quakerism when she finds that they're as rigid in their social rules, and becomes almost by accident. She writes a letter to William Lloyd Garrison and says, don't give up the fight for abolition. It's a cause worth dying for, she says, because they're being threatened by mobs in Boston. And he sees a Southern woman who has actually lived in slavery who opposes it, and she is catapulted to fame within the abolitionist movement.
And that's she finds an issue that begins to define her life.
She finds an issue that from very early on, she said, I have a grand destiny and I don't know what it is. And she becomes one of the most famous, popular, and infamous and controversial abolitionist speakers all across the Northeast.
At a time when women didn't speak much in public.
Well, they could speak to other women, but they couldn't speak in front of what the 19th century called promiscuous audiences.
That's an amazing term.
Isn't
We
that
just meant a co-ed
term?
audience.
Right. Co-ed audience. She's so charismatic that ultimately men pour in to see her, and she's condemned by the ministers of New England. Angelina's life is very interesting because she tells us how few people supported the abolitionist movement, how tiny it really was, and how many Northern ministers opposed it, and particularly opposed lending their pulpits to abolitionists.
Interesting. You know what? I recently read a biography of Florence Nightingale, and she, like Angelina Grimke, and they were both women of the Victorian period. You know, was upper middle class home, but deeply chafed at those restrictions and really wanted something to do.
That's right.
You know, looking for something to do to give their life meaning.
That's
other
what
than
Angelina means by her grand destiny. And what's wonderful about her is her entire life she lives up to the ideals of racial equality. I mean, she does not grow more cynical as she gets older. She does not abandon something because it's unpopular. She does not listen to the many racist abolitionists around her who want to end slavery but don't believe in racial equality. She's really an extremely admirable person. I know that sounds sort of corny, but you really admire her values and her devotion to an image that almost no one had.
And the Quakers eventually turned on her, right?
Oh, yes.
Because of
the Quakers turned on her, the abolitionists turned on her. The man she ultimately marries keeps writing her letters saying, Theodore Weld, who was a leading abolitionist, stop talking about racial equality and stop talking about women's equality. Just talk about ending slavery. And she says, no, that's just the beginning. It's not the end goal that I have. And they ultimately silence her. They really do.
Now, it helped that she had an independent income.
Yes, it did. Although I must say that she and her husband, Theodore Weld, lived in a kind of genteel poverty much of their life. So her income sustained them not at a really comfortable level. And he was a great advocate of all the fads of the 19th century, like the Graham diet, and almost starved her to death. She had several children right in a row, and she was incredibly anemic, and she was obeying her husband's demand that they only eat beans and graham bread.
Well, she was probably doing better economically and health-wise before she got married.
Yes, she absolutely was. She absolutely was in better shape.
Now, her sister Sarah, who had found the Quakers before she did, both went on the speaking circuit.
They did.
You know, was their family horrified by having two radical females in the family?
Absolutely. And South Carolina forbade Angelina to ever set foot there again. They warned her mother, if she ever sets foot in South Carolina again, we will arrest her immediately. And so she saw one of her brothers who visited. She never saw her family again. Sarah, and of course, one of the things that made it more interesting is they had a rather odd household. Sarah and Angelina and Theodore lived together all their life. Sarah never married, and she frequently referred to Theodore as our husband. I don't think it was sexual, but they were a very odd trio all their lives together. And I think part of it was for Angelina, Sarah was the only family
Right.
she would ever see again.
So Angelina finds his soulmate of sorts in Theodore Weld, a middle-aged, we think he was probably a virgin when he got married.
Oh, absolutely.
And a committed abolitionist. But marriage didn't seem to benefit her terribly much. It silenced her public voice.
Right.
She entered this period of domestic drudgery.
Yes.
Weld spent her money on farms and schemes and basically ran through it. And childbirth left her with a prolapsed uterus.
Yes.
So
yes, much of her life was spent depressed, and much of her about not being able to do anything. But some of this is Angelina's own fault. She wanted to prove that a woman who had been in public life could still be a perfect wife and mother. And so she refused to have anyone help her in the household, and she and Sarah had never cooked a meal in their life. There are hysterical letters in which they try to find out how you boil potatoes. I mean, they just really knew nothing. And Angelina was one of these people who was just determined to do it on her own. And so some of that character that made her admirable, also sometimes you wanted to say, Angelina, give yourself a break. You know, don't be so rigid about everything. So some of it was Theodore's fault, some of it was hers, as is often the case in relationships.
Let's move to Varina Howell,
Yeah.
a child of the Cotton Belt, but also a voracious reader, pretty well educated by her family, a woman of a quick tongue, not a Southern belle at all. How did she get to be as interesting as she was?
She was, I think, really the most brilliant person I have ever written about, even counting Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She was educated by a friend of the family, tutored in ways that Southern belles were not supposed to be. She was beautiful. Everyone thought she was a real beauty. But she was just extraordinarily bright, and she was very witty, and she was very quick. And while that would have been admirable in a man, not so good in a Southern belle.
But she was educated somewhat at home. Was it at home?
It was by a tutor, a friend of the family, at home. She spoke French beautifully. She read all the classics.
And what
she
state
read
are we in now?
She's in Mississippi, in Natchez.
Wow.
And at 17, she meets Jefferson Davis, who was a widower.
Twice her age.
Who says to her, I love you not just for your beauty, but for your mind as well.
Oh, we've heard that
and
before.
Poor 17-year-old Varina believed him.
As
soon as they got married, it was like having a wild stallion. He was going to break her will. She was going to become an obedient, silent wife or else. And he punished her. Never physically, but he went off to Washington to the government and says, I am not taking you with me. You have displeased me.
And until you learn to behave better.
Until you've learned to behave better.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back with more with Professor Carol Berkin, author of Civil War Wives, after the following message.
The city charter is the
Constitution of the 5 boroughs.
Now the Charter Revision Commission
is reviewing our government rulebook.
Help decide the future of your city.
To learn how,
visit nyc.gov/charter or call 311.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Professor Carol Berkin of the CUNY Graduate Center, and author of Civil War Wives, The Life and Times of Angelina Grimke Weld, Varina Howell Davis, and Julia Dent Grant. It's just been published by Alfred A. Knopf. We were talking about Varina Howell, a smart, accomplished, opinionated woman, but the struggle in her marriage, her husband trying to get her to be more subordinate, more wifey, to subdue her independence of mind.
Yes.
Did he succeed?
He succeeded in part, but it would just bubble up in Varina. She was not liked by other women. She only had one close woman friend, Mary Chestnut, who was equally smart and equally sarcastic. And here was Varina, the First Lady of the Confederacy. She was supposed to be sort of the leader of the women of the South. They hated her. They called her Queen Varina, and they meant that you haughty, witch, you haughty witch. And she and Mary Chestnut, after they would do something socially with the wives of the of the Richmond politicians, they would go back to Varina's room and just make fun of everybody. And part of the problem was that the women wanted to talk about children and clothing and fashion, and she wanted to talk about substantive things. She was intellectual, she was bright. The thing about Jefferson Davis is privately he tapped into all her abilities. Privately, he asked her advice on political matters. She composed letters for him. She criticized his speeches, but publicly, he wanted her to be the quiet, subservient wife. When he was imprisoned by the Union, she broke every female rule there was. She wrote letters to men she didn't know. She called and hired a lawyer. She asked Horace Greeley to write editorials trying to get her husband out. She broke all the feminine rules he believed in, and you know what? He cheered her on.
And she even moved into the prison with him for a while
She moved
to take
into the
care of
prison
him.
with
Probably
him.
would have died if she hadn't been there, right?
That's absolutely right. And he writes her what male historians have called the greatest love letters written in America. But if you read these letters from a woman's perspective, there's not a single word about loving her for who she is. I love you because you did this for me. I love you because you did that for me. I love you because you did this for me. Not a word about her as a person.
Yeah.
You just want to wring his neck.
When she was succeeded in getting him out of
She
prison.
got him out of
eventually.
prison.
When she was widowed, she finally gained the autonomy that she had
Yes.
sought, and she became a journalist in New York.
Yes, she moved to New York, which of course horrified Confederate diehards. She moved to New York and she ran what was the equivalent of a salon. Actors, writers, artists, playwrights, all people who Jefferson Davis would have disapproved of, flocked to hear her wit and her anecdotes and her story. She was really in her glory.
Right.
All the things he had disliked, they adored about her. But when she died, she said to her only remaining child on her deathbed, she said to her daughter, "Don't wear black. It might depress your husband."
Wow.
And so you can see that there's only so far you can come out of your socialization. There's only so far you can make your personality. She was worried about pleasing her son-in-law.
Julia Dent Howell was the most traditional of the three. What was she like?
Julia was not especially intellectual. Julia was not really interested in what was going on in the world except insofar as it affected her family. She adored her husband, Ulysses Grant. She called him Ules. And they adored,
that.
they adored each other right until his death. It was just an extraordinary marriage. Her whole view of the Civil War was it was good because it gave Ulysses a chance to shine. When slavery ended, it was inconvenient because then she had to hire someone to help take care of her children. There's an extraordinary exchange she has with some Southern women who were talking about, in the middle of the war, talking about the constitutionality of slavery and the constitutionality of secession. And Julia writes in her memoir, it was Constitution this, Constitution that. What is
What's the
this
Constitution?
Constitution they're talking about? And you read this and you think, no. I think she's quite interesting because I think she's very typical. I think in the midst of catastrophic events, changes of all sorts, political upheaval that the average person doesn't understand, she did what I think many of us do. She said, is it good for my family?
Right.
What will it mean for my family?
And she did defy her father by marrying
she did.
Grant.
Yes. He
Or
didn't,
wore him down.
didn't think that this was a good idea. He was not a very charming fellow. He was awkward. She was probably the only woman he ever spoke to up until that point. And he really didn't cut a dashing figure
Right.
like her own brother
Right.
did.
Right.
But And the father, of course, was pro-Southern, owned slaves. And here was the man who defeated the South. They invite her father to live with him in the White House when her mother has died. And he really is a curmudgeon and continues to insist that the Confederacy was right. And bless his heart, Ulysses S. Grant is really a very tolerant fellow. He would put up with this at the dinner table.
So Julia, she was not pretty, but she had a lot of personality.
Yes, she was actually quite homely. She was short, she was round, she had strabismus, she had a wandering eye, but her father had treated her like a princess, and her husband treated her like a princess, and so she
felt like a princess.
She felt like a princess. She really did. She had enormous confidence.
And because she brought him out.
Yes. He grew up in a household that would make American Gothic look friendly. I think his mother, Hannah, never hugged a child in her life and never praised him. His father was really a mean, demanding guy, and he meets this girl who comes from this rollicking, wonderful family that hug and kiss and sing songs together, and he really needed her. He leaves the Army the first time when he's stationed in California because he can't bear to be away from her.
But while he loved her, he treated her really much like the little wife, not to be taken seriously.
Yes. He indulged her. He would give her an allowance to run the household, and she would be over or under. She couldn't keep track of it, and he thought that was charming. She would say outrageous things, really naive things, and he thought it was charming. But that's because both of them accepted the gender norms. Husbands protected and wives charmed. And so it never bothered him that she was a little bit of a ditz. Actually, she was a lot of a ditz.
She was, of the three women, she was the one who was the most oblivious to, I guess, the impact that slavery had on the slaves.
Right.
And to the impact that the war had on people other than herself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. She really believed that all the slaves on their plantation were perfectly happy, that she couldn't understand what the issue was, and she didn't really care. When her slave ran away, who was called Little Julia, when Little Julia ran away, Julia Dent Grant's explanation for this, she couldn't imagine that she would be unhappy being a slave. So she said she must have fallen in love and run away with a man. That Julia could understand.
Right. So, I mean, was she relatively unaffected by the war? I mean, she didn't seem to have suffered in the way that the other two women did.
She didn't, but she did, like all women during the war, have to take on a lot of the responsibilities that her husband had had. He sends her elaborate instructions. You're to go to St. Louis, you're to try to sell this plot of land, this is how much you should ask for it. And she did it, but it never seemed to produce in Julia any sense of independence. She really doesn't acquire this till after his death, and she writes a memoir. And out of the blue, she goes to Mark Twain, who had helped publish Grant's. And she says, and I wrote a memoir, and I want just as much money for it as he got. And Twain says, really, you're not going to get it?
Not going to happen.
And I was quite stunned that she did. And so she says, then I'm not going to publish it.
Good for her.
And it's not published till the 1970s.
Which woman had the happiest life?
Oh, Julia,
Yeah.
definitely, definitely. Ignorance may indeed
Makes
be bliss.
Obliviousness
may be
pays.
bliss.
Which one did you like best?
Varina. I really felt for a woman who was being punished for being bright. You know, as a biographer, somehow you do sort of tend to get into their lives. And I thought, I knew what it was like growing up to have people say, that's not right, stop reading books, stop being smart, that's a bad thing.
Right.
But I admired Angelina most.
And what do you want, in our last minute, what do you want people to take from the book?
I want them to see that there are fascinating people who aren't male. I want them to see that you can't understand the Civil War unless you understand how women experienced it. And that would be my goal.
Okay. Well, I found the book really, really interesting.
Thank you.
And I thank you for writing it, and I hope a lot of people are going to read it because I think they'll
too.
enjoy it.
Thank you.
We're out of time. I want to thank Professor Carol Berkin for joining us. Civil War Wives, The Life and Times of Angelina Grimke Weld, Varina Howell Davis, and Julia Dent Grant has just been published by Alfred A. Knopf. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.